I've already got 2 or 3 people in the chat, so they should be able to check really
Okay.
quick if the sound is good. All right, it looks like we're live. So, David, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on here and talk. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Thank you, Tom, for having me. It's a privilege to be on. My name is David Wilkinson. I work at Durham University, where I'm principal of one of the colleges, and I teach in the Department of Theology and Religion. My background is as a theoretical astrophysicist. I worked in cosmology and star formation, and then moved over to theology, and I teach theology a little bit these days.
Cool. So, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in the existence of a God. Could you tell me what reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? Then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons and hear your thoughts on my position.
Yes, of course, Tom. Let me start with three things which I think I find compelling evidence, but not proofs in any way. The first is something about pointers from the universe, and this goes back to my earlier training and career as an astrophysicist. There were a number of things that, as a scientist, struck me not as classical proofs for the existence of God, but something about whether there's a deeper story to the universe which is worth a conversation. For instance, the nature of the laws of physics, the fact that at the heart of the complexity of the universe is simplicity, elegance, beauty in the laws of physics, that they're universal, and indeed that they're intelligible. So Albert Einstein famously said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Now, that for me begs a deeper question, not just for me, but a number of the scientists who I continue to work for, who wouldn't call um, themselves Christians in any way or other religious faith communities. But where do the laws of physics themselves come from? For me, science assumes the laws of physics, it doesn't explain them. So there's something about the laws of physics. I think then there's a pointer about a sense of the anthropic balances in the laws and circumstances of the universe. Now, I don't want to push that too strongly because I think multiverse is a very important concept within both physical and philosophical argument. But I think, as what Paul Davies calls the Goldilocks enigma, that the laws and circumstances of the universe seem to be extraordinarily balanced to give the possibility of carbon-based life. I think there's something in that. Then I think third pointer for me is something about a sense of awe at the universe, a sense of beauty, not just in the vastness of the universe, but something in the beauty of the laws of physics themselves provokes for many of us a sense of awe. And again, I think that leads to a question, is there a deeper story to the universe than just the physics? So there's something about the areas of the universe itself. I think the second area of evidence for me is religious experience. Now, that, of course, is diverse and complex, even within faith communities themselves, which keep an identity under one particular naming or banner. There's diversity. But this sense of the transcendence, something that you see throughout human history, which leads to prayer, worship, contemplation of the significance of life, death, what it means to be human. I think there's something that I want to take seriously about that widespread sense of religious experience. The third area of evidence, which is the most important for me, revolves not around philosophical argument, but revolves around the claim which particularly you get within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and that is that God self-reveals within the universe. Now, for Christianity, that's historical revelation, supremely in the claim that God became a human being in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And that was the thing that drew me to Christianity in the first place. That was the thing that continues to be the center point of what I would call Christian faith. That the God who created the universe actually became part of the space-time history of the universe universe in history, and therefore there's something for us to talk about. Now, as I said at the beginning, those three areas for me are not knockdown proofs of the existence of God. Each of them needs an assessment of the evidence, an interpretation of the evidence. There's no inevitable right answer in interpretation of that evidence. And that's why I think that gives us something to talk about. So those are the reasons that I would put as the basis for belief in God. And of course, as you might expect, as a person from the Christian faith, I'd want to say that for me, there has been a personal experience of the transcendence of God, which makes a difference to my life. So those are some of the areas for me.
Yeah, for sure. So I definitely understand the complexity of the laws of physics and why they are. The fine tuning is definitely a perplexing problem in physics, but I don't see why that would be indicative of a God. I mean, sure, you could say that a God might be able to explain these things, but that doesn't seem to be able to answer the question that physicists are asking when they're asking, well, what caused the fine tuning? Because there's quite a number of really big problems in physics that we want to know the solution to. And just saying God did it doesn't really seem to provide an answer to that. Like, why is there the matter-antimatter disparity, or what is the cause of the perturbations in space-time? Like, when we ask those kinds of questions, just saying, well, God did it that way, it isn't really a very satisfying answer. And so physicists seem to prefer more physics-based answers with combinations of different principles, particles, and laws, like the multiverse or string theory and M theory, and those kinds of theories, because they can provide more specific answers to the questions that we're asking about the fine-tuning constants and the laws of physics. Whereas just saying God doesn't seem to be able to accomplish that. So it seems like, from my perspective, that the answers provided by physics are far better answers, whereas the answer provided by a deity doesn't seem to be an answer at all, because it's not answering the questions we're actually asking when we're talking about fine-tuning. It just seems more like a kind of assertion.
I think that's fair, and I agree with that in large part, because that's why I was careful to say that I don't think fine-tuning can give you any proof of the existence of God. And as you well know, design arguments traditionally, as they go back, were criticized by David Hume quite rightly, that even if you have a fine-tuning argument or a design argument, even at the very least, if it tells you that there may be a creator, it doesn't tell you anything about that creator or what that creator could be. So I want to say that actually, for me, the God explanation of fine-tuning is not an excuse to get away from the continued work of the physicist. So as a physicist, I want to keep pushing the questions. I want to keep asking, where does the fine-tuning itself originate from in terms of a scientific explanation? Just in the same way that if some of my religious believer friends would want to press the temporal form of the cosmological argument and say, well, our laws of physics break down at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, that must be God. I mean, that's a cop-out for me, because I think, as you rightly say, we've got possibilities, perhaps with M theory, and that allow us to explain that. But I think where the key is, I think there are two things which are worth a deeper discussion about it. The first is that you can trace these things back, but you're still left with why the laws of physics are the way they are. So that even if you say there's a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum which leads to a small expanding region which is inflated by the theory of inflation and becomes a Hubble universe, you're still left with, where does quantum theory itself come from? Where does general relativity itself come from? So there's that sense of where the laws of physics come from, which is still left as a question. And for me, that's an area, a metaphysical, philosophical, theological question, rather than simply a scientific question. And therefore, there is a limit to science, but not within its own territory, because I want to push through so we might get a full explanation of the first 10 to the minus 43 of a second, and a full explanation of the Goldilocks enigma. But that's still going to be dependent on the physical laws. The second thing is that there is, I think, alongside questions of physical explanation, I think there are questions of purpose and value, which again are philosophical, metaphysical, discussion. It's not a thing that physicists themselves um, have the answers to. They're fascinated by them. So when Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, Lord Rees, very distinguished British cosmologist, wrote a book a few years ago called Just Six Numbers, where he went into the fine-tuning of the universe. He said, basically, you've got three possibilities to explain it. One is that God did it. Second is that actually you don't ask the question at all. You just say, well, this is a very interesting universe. It doesn't need explanation. Or you explain through multiverse theory. But the trouble with multiverse theory is that multiverse theory, which I don't have any problem with, I think there are good indications that we may be one of many, many universes. But I do think that multiverse theory borders that physical, metaphysical divide, in the sense that, can we ever know that other universes actually exist in a physical sense? Is it a metaphysical suggestion? So, Tom, I really want to agree with you that playing the God card in some of these areas to end the scientific discussion is not what we should be doing. That seems to me to simply beg other questions. But I do think that if we use these indications from the universe to talk about the origin of the laws of physics or questions of purpose, then I think there's something to be said.
Yeah, so from my perspective, why would because you're right that if we start with the assumptions of science, it doesn't explain the fundamental laws of physics, and we'd have to ask the question, why are the laws of physics the way they are? But it seems like we have the same problem with God. Even if we assume God exists, we would have to say, well, why is God the way he is? And any proposed solution you have to that question, like say maybe it's a necessity of God's nature that he is the way he is, we could apply the same solution to a naturalistic hypothesis, say, for example, naturalistic pantheism, where there's just an eternal, all-powerful nature kind of a thing, and say, well, its nature is the way it is because it's of a natural necessity in the same way God is. And so we could say that just as the theist says that God has a necessary nature, the physicist could say that nature has a necessary nature. And the way it is determined by brute facts about its own existence, kind of a thing. And like, yeah, you mentioned the three possibilities, which is Agrippa's trilemma in philosophy. Either it's a brute facts or infinite regress or circular reasoning in some sense. And so those are always going to be the three possibilities we have. It doesn't seem like positing a God in any way gives you a better or more grounded possibility than just positing a natural solution like naturalistic pantheism.
Yeah, spot on. And that's why I don't think myself you can ever use a physical argument for the existence of God. Because of what you've just said is absolutely right. The second is that at the end of the day, I'm not just interested in whether God exists. I'm interested in what kind of God exists. And that's where, for me, the holding together of the three areas of considerations from the physical nature of the universe with religious experience and historical revelation becomes so important. So I don't have a sense in which I'm led to God by some kind of linear argument. I'm led to belief in God, and particularly the God of Jesus of Nazareth, by that sense of holding these three areas together of the universe, physical experience, religious experience, and historical revelation. And I think the reason I'm led to that is for exactly the reason that you've just outlined. Those attempts to try and argue God as the answer come to the problem, the obstacle, which is once you apply it to God, why can't you apply it to a physical theory? And just those. Sorry to stray back to the cosmological argument in temporal form, but of course, the 7-year-old who said to me the other day, quite rightly, but who created God? I mean, that's if you take God as the first cause of the physical universe, and you argue in a linear fashion for God in that way, you simply open the question of who created God, because you're applying that space-time reasoning back to God. Why not just say there's a physical theory there? So I'm finding myself agreeing with you a great deal on this. And you rightly pointed out some of the fallacies of some of the arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah, so then you said that the main reason was from personal experience and revelation.
Yeah, religious experience and revelation, and then a sense of the reality of God in my own life.
Yeah, and a sense of awe. You said the sense of awe from
Yeah, a
physics as
sense of
well.
awe. Yes, so there's something I think which is about the sense of awe. Again, um, I don't think you can um, uh, argue that as any proof of God. There's a very interesting character that I've done a little bit of historical work on. His name is Temple Chevalier, and he was the first professor of astronomy at Durham University. He was appointed in 1842. In those days, he was professor of astronomy, professor of mathematics, and professor of Hebrew, all at the same time. And Temple Chevalier was an astronomer. He did work on sunspots as a crater on the moon named after him. He's not terribly well known, but he wrote in the 19th century a book. He was a contemporary of Darwin, which makes him even more interesting. He wrote a book in the 19th century, which was really a kind of, wow, look at that book. So he took his astronomy and he coupled it with his Christian belief. And he went through a number of things about the universe and what was known about the universe in the 19th century. But interestingly enough, he wasn't the kind of classical person that you read in the history books of the 19th century who tried to argue for the existence of God from design. He simply said, isn't the universe interesting? Isn't it fantastic? Isn't it mind blowing? Now, he says, I happen to believe that this God that I believe in has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Let me bring that into the conversation. And so he wasn't simply using the design argument in its own isolated way. He was bringing it into a conversation with his theological view. And for me, these things do hold together rather than being separated apart.
How so? How do they hold together? Because from my perspective, a sense of awe can be explained biologically. We get senses of awe in all kinds of silly things, like looking at cat videos on YouTube. I wouldn't say that those would be indicative of a God any more so or less so than the physics argument. Same
Yes,
with the meaning
yes.
and purpose that you mentioned. That seems like those could be explained biologically, or even as a naturalistic law that we haven't discovered yet. Why would we need God, or why would that indicate a God any more so than a naturalistic hypothesis?
Again, I'm not wanting to resist a naturalist hypothesis in the sense of, um, if I look at a cat video, which I never do, but if I did, and I laughed at it, then I would be fully open to a neuroscientist coming along and saying that I can explain the firing of the neurons and the way that memory is related to the brain's forming concepts of humor and concepts of the world as it is, and actually giving a natural explanation for what was happening when I was watching a cat video. But Donald Mackay, who was professor of neuroscience at Keele University, forgive me, Tom, most of my illustrations are from the UK context in this. Mackay was one of the pioneers in neuroscience at Keele University. And Mackay used to say, you've got to be careful of the nothing buttery fallacy. That is, be careful that if you have a natural explanation of something, you don't simply say it's nothing but that. Now, it seems to me that we can and we want to pursue the way that our brain and our understanding of the universe can be explained in biological, physiological, psychological terms. But is there something more to it than that? And therefore, there may be a complementary understanding of this in terms of religious significance. Now, hear me right in this. I don't want to go purely down the Stephen Jay Gould line and talk about non-overlapping magisterium.
Yeah.
I don't want to say that the two are simply my theological belief and my scientific belief are completely independent. And I believe one thing on a Sunday and believe something else Monday to Saturday. And in a sense, that's how I hold it. For me, John Polkinghorne, who was one of my teachers and mentors, talked about the nature of dialogue, that these things are held together by critical conversation with each other, that science poses sometimes difficult questions to theology, and theology poses difficult questions to science. It doesn't always give answers. And just as you and I are having a conversation, which at times will be a bit messy. It won't come to any conclusion in it, but at least we're finding common ground to pose questions to each other, to challenge each other, maybe even to agree with each other at time to time. So for me, science and theology are in that critical conversation with each other. So for example, there's a conversation which actually is helpful at times. And I think, although some historians have overplayed this, some of the Judeo-Christian influences on the growth of science were positive in terms of the scientific revolution. I think then there are difficult questions that science poses towards theology, particularly areas of natural evil within the universe. But David Hume and Immanuel Kant knew about those very clearly. So it's that kind of model of conversation, so that when we look at anthropic balances or sense of awe or whatever, those are things which pose questions about, is there a purpose or a meaning to the universe? At which point theology's claims about meaning and purpose can be examined alongside those, rather than providing some perfect system where the two can be put together, whether it be a process theology or something of that sort, where you try and marry science and theology into one system. I'm afraid I'm not a great philosopher. I explained that to you before we arranged this interview. I'm into messiness, I'm afraid. I'm into conversation. I'm into, yes, trying to ask the philosophical questions, but not coming to one simple theological or philosophical system which explains everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, from my perspective, like, why you mentioned the nothing buttery, and from my perspective, like, if we see a hoof print in the ground, like, you could say it's probably caused by a horse, but you could say, well, maybe we shouldn't conclude the nothing buttery. Maybe it's not just a horse. It could also be a horse with wings and that could fly, or maybe it's a horse being ridden by a leprechaun or something. Like, you can always add more things to it. But it seems like if we only have reason to conclude it's a horse, and that can be fully explained just by the naturalistic horse that we already have evidence for, it doesn't seem reasonable to just call that nothing buttery. It seems like, well, why would you go beyond the nothing buttery? That seems like the only evidence we have is for the nothing but the horse so far. And there needs to be something more to justify the conclusion that there's more than the horse.
Context makes a difference to that question, doesn't it? I was driving, this was before lockdown. I was driving through the countryside in the UK, and I drove past a gas station. That's what you call them, I think, in the States. We would call them petrol stations. And by one of the gas pumps, the fuel pumps, was standing a black horse. Now, as I drove past, you can imagine my surprise at seeing the horse. Not because driving in the countryside, it's unusual to see a horse. It was the context that made the difference. The fact of, why was this horse standing beside a gas station pump? I didn't want to imagine what might be going on. But you begin to then ask the question. The context drives to various questions. So when Bertrand Russell many, many years ago said, if I look at fine tuning or things of that sort, it wasn't called that in those days. I don't want to ask the why question. I simply can say I'm not interested in the why question. What Lord Rees in Just Six Numbers says is, he says, but the context makes a difference. Actually, the context raises the why question. Now, for me, the context here is, I go back, I'm afraid, to the persistence of religious experience and the occurrence or the claim of historical revelation, which means that I take some of the scientific and philosophical arguments, and they've got an interesting context when I put them in that sense. So, agree with you again that simply from a footprint, a horse print, footprint of a horse. You can add on a lot of things. And of course, religion has been very good at adding on a lot of things to fairly simple physical arguments. And so the development of the cosmological and design argument, for me, is exactly what you've said. They've taken something about the universe, but then smuggled in almost through the back door a whole lot of theological understanding of God, and named or claimed the argument for that. I'm not into that myself.
How do you relate the personal experience and revelation to the gas station? Like, why would that be relevant to the context of the physics?
Because I've got to, if I'm going to take into account the whole of human existence, and of course you'll realize that I'm not a reductionist as a scientist. I do want to reduce systems so that they can be understood in physics terms, and I'm afraid I've always been an unrepentant physicist in that. In fact, I was so arrogant when I first was a physicist that I thought that chemistry was for people who couldn't do physics, and biology was for people who couldn't do chemistry. And I won't tell you what I thought of sociologists. I mean, now I've repented, and I've come to see that actually human experience of the world is very rich, and complexity adds new layers of understanding to it. And therefore, for me, the physics can't be simply isolated from that wider human experience, that wider context of history and of religious experience. Now, I'm open to the criticism, and perhaps rightly so, the critique, that's been part of my life story. It has. So my understanding of Christianity began at the age of 17, just as I was starting a university course in physics. So the context of my own personal life has held these things together in conversation. That's not true of everyone, and I'm not saying that it should be true of everyone. But I think there's enough within our experience of the world and our experience of human history that says we can't simply do our science without its wider historical, philosophical, and human setting. To be a scientist, as you well know, is a very human thing to do. It's full of being human and being human in community. That's what science is all about. So there is a wider context to it.
Sure, I definitely would agree with that. There's definitely a larger context, but from my perspective, which I'm using way too much.
Sure.
So,
No. So am I.
It seems like we need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. So there's definitely a larger context there, and it could be lots of different things. And so we need some kind of a methodology to show which of these larger contexts are the imaginary ones and which are the real ones. That's why I usually go with the novel testable predictions approach. And I say that if my hypothesis is true, then I can make these predictions about what will happen in this experiment, so on and so forth. And if we get the results I expect, that's a good reason to believe that that hypothesis is describing something in reality rather than just my imagination. And it seems like the only kinds of hypotheses that have ever been able to successfully do that seem to be naturalistic hypotheses. When you add in a god of some kind or a supernatural agent or anything more than that, it always seems to be unable to produce the same kind of results of just purely naturalistic hypotheses. And so it seems hard for me to accept that we should add in this larger context of the personal experience when it seems like it can be explained purely just imaginary for the most part. Like many other psychological phenomena we know about, like you mentioned, that religious experience is very diverse, and there's lots of people who have very different religious experience that would be potentially contradictory. Like there's of some like many different gods in the Roman Empire and the Greeks and the Egyptians, as opposed to just a monotheistic kind of Islam, Judaism, Christianity kind of a god. So these different experiences people have seem to contradict with one another pretty drastically. So it seems that at least somebody's wrong, and so they can't all be right, but at least we know for certain that at least one of them is wrong. And it could be the case that they're all wrong. So by using this methodology to differentiate imagination from reality, wouldn't that lead us to the conclusion it's probably more likely natural than to conclude that it's a supernatural entity?
Gosh, this is a really good question. Thank you for it. I mean, this is a terrifically rich discussion. And can I just pick up one or two things from this, because it sparks off so many things. The first is this really interesting distinction between imagination and reality. And I'm afraid you've got a physicist here who, the more I went into physics, the more I became confused by the distinction between that which is imaginary and that which is real. So from reading Hawking on imaginary time as an explanation for a no boundary proposal for the universe, into quantum theory, where one of my favorite comments from Polkinghorne was that quantum theory breaks the tyranny of common sense. And of course, we still don't know how to solve the measurement problem in quantum theory in terms of how the wave function collapses and the uncertainty of the micro becomes the certainty of the macro. Through to, I think, you know, I mean, you mentioned M theory earlier. I mean, M theory famously can be critiqued on a number of levels, not least over whether it could make any predictions that could be measured within the universe. Now, I don't want to use that to simply decry the argument. I mean, I think there's still something in it which I'll come back to, but I do want to say that the imaginary reality distinction may be not as strong for me as a physicist as it is for other people. But you raise a problem of predictability, and here I think certainly Christian faith needs to be very clear that when it comes to a postulate about God, the predictability test doesn't work in any way the same way that it does for science. And so those tests which have tried to do scientific experiments on the efficacy of prayer, for example, by having a group of heart patients where a group of people pray for one group and not for the others, which, I mean, to be honest, I find morally dubious anyway. But that kind of trying to predict whether prayer works, or the sense that you can predict future religious experience. Hold my hands up and say, absolutely. It doesn't work in theology in the way that it does in science. I think within theology, the predictability becomes whether the postulate fits many different observations of human experience, not just the universe, but is it consistent with historical revelation? Is it consistent with religious experience? And then rightly, the third kind of thing I take from the point is that the questioning of diversity within religious experience. So that is it consistent with religious experience? Well, I think it's probably the existence of God is consistent with the envelope of religious experience. But you've got a far from normal distribution of religious experience going on. I worked as a physicist for a short time in India with a number of Hindu colleagues, and was struck by just how complex within Hinduism itself is the description of an experience of the divine, all the way from streams of Hinduism which actually don't have any concept of divine at all, right through to monotheism and systems where there are many divine personas within it. And so even within Hinduism itself, there's this great diversity. And I think for me, one of the issues has always been, and I don't have an easy answer to this, the wide diversity of religious experience, and particularly the way that that leads to the growth of so many different religious institutions and structures. But I do think that there is something about encounter with the transcendent, which is consistent with the prediction that there is a God. But of course, we're back to the question, what is the nature of that God? Because unless you start to define the nature of God in some way, you know, is God simply a giant turtle who starts the universe off? Well, if you simply use the term God, you can fill it with just about anything you want. And that's where the diversity within the religions becomes really interesting, because each are attempting to engage with the question of what is the nature of the transcendent that they're encountering. Sorry, that's not a simple answer to what was a very rich question. But if we were to have 3 hours on this, those would be some of the areas that I'd enjoy talking with you about.
Yeah, for certain. I definitely agree with you. The perplexing nature of physics, imaginary time using vectors and imaginary numbers as trying to
Yes,
explain
yes,
the universe, and the different qualities of quantum mechanics, like the collapse of how it can go in infinitely different ways in the Feynman diagrams.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
actual infinites exist. Yes, for certain.
yeah. Now that's where I mean, I think that I think the imagination is sometimes within the way the use of the imagination within science is fascinating, isn't it? Michael Polanyi, great philosopher of science, talked about tacit skills, and he picked up on the use of the imagination or even the use of intuition in theory formation. So why does Einstein get to E equals mc squared by saying the speed of light should be the same in all frames of reference?
And
Or
time
even more,
bends. Imagine that
yeah,
time bends.
that's right. That's right. Or even more bizarrely, how does Kekule have a dream about a snake which swallows its own tail and say, oh, yes, that must be the benzene molecule and the way that carbon is in a ring structure? Polanyi made a lot about the creative imagination within science. And certainly within my area of cosmology, and particularly with people like Hawking, you saw a creative imagination extraordinary. Now, what was interesting, sorry, I'm getting carried away by this. What was interesting about Hawking was if you then ask what kind of philosophical position Hawking had, it's actually really difficult to pin down. At times, he speaks as an idealist, as if this is almost a universe which is simply subjective to us. At times, he's a realist, where he talks about physical reality and M theory and um, quantum gravity in different ways. And I think this is part of that difficulty between the imaginary and the reality that you get at that uh, forefront of physics.
Oh yeah, definitely. And how Pauli came up with just randomly picked a number he liked, just come up with another
Yes,
constant.
yes, yes, absolutely. Now, part of the way, of course, then the scientific community limits and asks questions, then takes that creative imagination back to your question about, okay, how do you assess the data? How do you deal with hypotheses? What are the predictions of any hypothesis? So it's not free ranging imagination, it has limits to it. Now, for me, the theological task has some um, resonance with that, in the sense that theologians, whatever their faith community, do exercise a creative imagination. And so you hear Christian theologians talking about how to think about the reality of the Trinity. I mean, um, that does need creative imagination to imagine that. But then I think for me, theology has to be also data rich. It has to be evidence and experience rich. And there is a community assessment of those models, um, which is where you get questions such as or terms such as orthodoxy and heresy coming in. Sorry, I'm getting again off on a tangent. Forgive me.
Oh, that's totally fine. But it seems like the fact that we have naturalistic explanations of certain kinds of beliefs that humans have a tendency to adopt, like, for example, anthropomorphism, where we attribute human properties to non-human things, or type 1 and type 2 errors. Like if you hear a rustle in the bushes and you don't run away and it's a lion, well, you get eaten. But if you run away, even if it's just the wind, you survive. So we have a tendency to attribute agency to things where might
Yeah,
not be any. It seems like those kinds of human psychological tendencies have a very strange ability to explain a lot of these things that we see as personal experience in relation to a god. And so it seems like that would be a better explanation than saying there actually is a god. Like if we're trying to use Occam's razor, what is the simplest hypothesis? Then we should probably adopt that. This seems very natural. It doesn't seem like there's anything there that we need a god to explain, and we can explain these in far simpler naturalistic terms, which is why we would want that than testable predictions way. Because if we could do testable predictions, say if a god exists, I'd expect this testable result, that would provide us something that just the evolutionary biology wouldn't explain. It's something about reality to to cause us to justify the conclusion there's something else other than just biology here. And the fact that we don't have that, the fact that, as you mentioned, theology doesn't provide the level of the testable predictions that science does, it begs the question, well, why should we believe that it is anything more than imaginary if we don't have that methodology to differentiate imagination from reality?
Yeah, I try to argue that there's different kinds of testable predictions. Not that theology doesn't have those. I think they're about consistency with the vast range of human religious and what you might call naturalistic explanations. The the point about ascribing human agents, the point about ascribing agency to events, I think, is really important. And I think there's a whole category of religious errors, theological errors, which you can see in history, where our tendency to ascribe agency as a cop-out for the more difficult question. Now, classically, sometimes that's referred to as God of the gaps, that if there's no explanation or there's no scientific explanation, you insert God as the agent into that. And I'm not a great fan of God of the gaps. I think it's a bad argument on a whole number of reasons, not least that it reduces God to simply being an agent in the small gaps. And once the gap is filled, God becomes irrelevant to it. But I think there's something which I've found as a physicist and as a theologian, which is about the surprising nature of the universe and God, which makes me at least pause. So it's that thing which, when I look at the universe and I see the elegance of the laws of physics, John Barrow, another English cosmologist, talks about the surprising nature of the universe. Peter Medawar talked about this as well. There's something which leads you to pause and ask a deeper story. And when I come to Christian theology, there's something really quite surprising. I mean, if I was to construct a religious belief system, I think the last thing I'd do, Tom, would be to introduce a trinity into an understanding of God. I mean, it would make my life as a Christian theologian a lot easier if there wasn't something called the Trinity. But the Trinity, a belief in God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was a result of the early church being driven to try and cope with the surprising nature of the transcendent, the surprising nature of God. Now, when you're driven to a model like that, then I think you can begin to say, well, okay, how is this consistent or inconsistent with other human experience? The fact that relationality is so important for us as humans, is at the heart of the universe. Where does that come from? Well, Christian theologians will say that's consistent with the fact that relationality is at the heart of God himself, at the heart of the divine. So these aren't predictive hypothesis checking in the way that scientists would do them. It's a different craft. It's a different way of looking at things. Doesn't mean it's less than the scientist or the philosopher would be doing, but it's a different way. And looking for consistency of the hypothesis with lots of different areas of evidence is a slightly different way of doing it. But I think theology does do that.
When you said those was like a different kind of testing or different kind of predictions, how so? How would that be a kind of testing or predictions that would be on the same par as a scientist in some sense? Because it seems like
I don't think it's on. I mean, I wouldn't. I'd be hesitant myself to talk about the same par as a scientist. I think they're just different ways of looking at the world. This was one of the real problems for me when I made the switch from being a professional scientist to actually study theology. In fact, I mean, if we just keep it between ourselves, as I'm sure this is between ourselves, one of my first theology classes I was thrown out of for being too disruptive, for asking too many questions. But that was the kind of training that I had as a scientist, and I wanted to keep pushing the way the methodology in science goes, and partly asking the question, well, what does that mean for for the future. If we were to test this, what would it mean? Um, and I think the way that the historian looks at the world, the way that the theologian looks at the world, is a different way of assessing evidence and building models. So the historian, for example, looks for consistency of evidence. You unearth evidence and you build a model and you ask the question, is this consistent? Your historical model isn't able to be extended into the future. You're simply looking at the past. And religion, particularly Christian theology, does a great deal of that. That's why the scriptures, the early church, the church fathers are fundamental to any theology course at university that you might do, a degree. It's about checking whether this is consistent with the data that we have before us in terms of religious texts or claims of religious experience. Now, that's a very different way that I would do as a scientist, although there is sometimes a parallel. So, as a cosmologist, you ask me, how do we know that the Big Bang is the best model that we've got? Well, in a sense, I'm partly a historian as a cosmologist. I can't ask a 17-year-old to go into a lab and explode a universe in a Big Bang. I mean, that would be a bit catastrophic. But I can say I've looked at the microwave background radiation, I've looked at the redshift, I've looked at the helium abundance, I've looked at the polarization of the microwave background. And that seems to fit a model of the Big Bang, which is a historical model. So I think it's difficult to extend some of the scientific criteria for truth into the historical or the theological realm. They have their own ways of checking truth, which is more about consistency of the evidence.
Well, there's two things that came to my mind there. The first was that the Big Bang does seem to make testable predictions about things like the heat consistency in the CMB and other things about the universe or the galaxy separation. And so we can use the hypothesis that the Big Bang happened to make testable predictions, which can be confirmed. So that seems to be a way that we don't need to purely rely on history to verify the Big Bang. And in the case of history, it seems like historical accounts are only allowed to be used if they already have an empirical basis. So, for example, in history, to quote Mike Licona, an American Christian guy, he says that most historians and biblical scholars hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity, then lists a bunch of names and things. The explanation being that history can only establish the truth of claims of things that already have an empirical basis in reality. So like if I said I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe because dogs and seeing them is something we see quite often. We have lots of empirical evidence of dogs, their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, chemical composition, et cetera, et cetera. But if I said I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe because there's no prior background knowledge of unicorns actually existing. Therefore, history isn't able to adjudicate claims that don't already have an empirical basis, like miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. And so when in the historical methodology, you're only allowed to use combinations of things that have already been demonstrated to exist. And you can't use history as a basis to conclude some new category of things exists. And that seems to be the consensus in how history works. In physics, many similar things. Like in physics, you're only allowed to use combinations of verified principles, particles, and laws in physics to make a new model. And then you have to use that new model to make predictions before it's ever confirmed. So even if you hypothesize a new weakly interactive massive particle or whatever, the WIMPs, you can't actually say it exists until you can confirm it in some kind of testable predictive way. Sean Carroll actually just recently posted an article against this. He says we shouldn't do it, we should just go on simplicity. But I totally disagree. I think I love the testable predictions way.
Well, I mean, fair, on the first point, absolutely, you're right. And that's why I said the Big Bang is a bit like history, but it's not entirely that, for exactly the reasons that you say. The Big Bang model itself then can be extended to ask a number of questions about the universe. And so fair cop on that, as we'd say in Britain. You're absolutely right. On the second, by the way, I have some sympathy with Carol's position myself, so that's another conversation between us. But I don't myself take that view of history. And I guess the foremost Christian theologian who's argued this in the last few decades is Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, in terms of his professional name, particularly in a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. Now, Wright actually takes on that view of history and says, actually, that's an inadequate view of history. And his argument is that you take the historical evidence and that drives you to a conclusion. Whether that involves resurrection or magic or unicorns or whatever, you ask the question, how reliable is this historical material? Now, of course, as a scientist, when it comes to, say, the resurrection, I have no idea how the resurrection happened. I mean, that's beyond a mere brain of mine, but it's beyond science itself. But as a scientist, I can, and as a historian, more particularly, I can ask questions about the evidence. Now, not to prove that something exists. I mean, that would just be ludicrous. Or to prove the event of the resurrection, but to say that the interpretation that this was the resurrection of Jesus Christ is more compelling than any other available argument. Now, I'm open then to a provisionality of conclusion. I'm open then to other explanations coming along, or the bones of Jesus being discovered in some tomb in Jerusalem. I'm vulnerable to that. I'm open to it. I'm all right with that, actually. There's a provisionality about that. But I think Tom Wright is right in this sense, that history has to be judged on its own merit, and by introducing into the historical process that miracles cannot happen is a huge assumption, particularly if you take the sense of the attestation to the divine within the human record. So yeah, I'm sympathetic with Carol on the fact that not all physical theories might have physical consequences. And I do love simplicity in terms of physics, and I'm sympathetic to Wright on his view of history on this.
Yeah, for certain, I would definitely agree. In certain cases, we can't test M theory. There's no way, because it makes every possible prediction that could ever be made. So how could you differentiate?
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
But in the case of history, it seems like the reason that most historians don't think that we can use that as a basis to come to conclusions of like miracles or magic or whatever is because it's such an unreliable metric. If we look back in history, there's lots of claims of miracles and magic. Every ancient historian made claims of certain kinds of miracles. Like you can see the ancient Roman historians, sure. Josephus and Tacitus, talking about the formation of Rome from Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf, or the historians talking about the adventures of the Greek gods and the Roman gods and how they interact with humans. And every one of those cases we assume is false because there's no corroborating basis for any of them. Why would we say that there's a special case here where we can apply this to, for example, Christianity, and use that as a basis to conclude that miracles actually existed, rather than just saying, we probably shouldn't believe that for the same reason we don't believe it in a court case. Like if we have a modern day examples, there's lots of actual court cases of people invoking God as an eyewitness, or saying that they were killed by magic or miracles or witches and wizards and things. And those are all thrown out of a court case because there's no precedent in the legal system for those kinds of things.
Well, yeah, but we've got to be careful there in terms of, I don't want to argue Christianity as a special case in any way. But I do want us to be confident in our ability to be controlled by the evidence. So in part, the God made me do it in the court case can be easily demonstrated by other evidence that's around at the time. Now, you mentioned earlier another interesting contemporary aspect of this, which is the existence of aliens or UFOs, and the claims that people have been abducted or have met aliens, that we've seen flying saucers. And I hesitate to say, but I've been interested in this for a number of years, both for the scientific and the religious aspects of it. What I don't simply want to do is come to such claims and say they have to be false for a number of reasons. The first is, it may be that there's extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe. I think the scientific arguments are finely balanced. Secondly, I want to ask questions of people's real experience. And so simply not to dismiss it, but actually to keep pushing the question. So, for instance, when I read a survey that 3 million Americans will claim that they've been abducted by aliens. Well, I want to ask a question about that, if you'll forgive me, Tom. And the question is an obvious one. Why would aliens want 3 million Americans in that sense? But I mean, that's a question to push with people. And I want to ask people, about the observational evidence of UFOs. And we know that 99.9% of them are various natural phenomenon. Probably the other 0.1 is as well, but there's an immediate explanation of it. But I want to take the evidence seriously rather than simply dismissing it from the start that this can't be alien, because it just maybe. And please don't say that I'm saying that we're a visited planet or anything like that. I simply want to be open to the question. Now, when it comes to the historical process, I certainly do not want to use the historical process and say that Christianity is a special case in this, nor that claims today of miracles are special cases. So if someone within the Christian church says to me that they've been healed by prayer, I want to ask questions about that. I want to be serious about that. I want to say, well, what was the condition? What did the doctors say? What other explanations could there be? Could this be simply holistic medicine where we know the mind-brain interface is more complex than we know about? So sometimes by believing, etc., you get physical benefit from it. All of that. I want to be open to history and neuroscience and medicine in all of this. But I don't want to rule out the possibility of miracle from the start. It seems to me that assumes a closed system. And I'm not sure that's a very good way of doing history. But as you can tell, I'm not a historian. And I'll defer to those who are on some of these bigger questions.
Well, I would totally agree. I don't think we should ever prima facie exclude miracles or aliens or anything other except the square circles. We can prima facie exclude square circles.
Yes.
But that isn't really the contention I would bring against the argument. It's the fact that it's something like Laplace saying that you must proportion your claims to the evidence, or proportion your beliefs to the evidence, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, to quote Carl Sagan's version. I think Hume has another version of the similar thing.
Yes, he does. He does, yeah.
So from my perspective, the historical evidence of the testimony isn't sufficient to justify belief that these things are true. It's not that we're excluding them as possible explanations. It's the fact that the historical evidence isn't sufficient to make them reasonable to believe. Just like if you have testimony of someone who said they saw a unicorn, that wouldn't be reasonable to believe just based off their testimony. You would need some additional thing there to make it justifiable. I mean, we have thousands of examples of people claiming to see Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, and tens of thousands about aliens, and millions about homeopathy working. I think homeopathy is a big thing in the UK. Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
so we have lots and lots of examples of people using their eyewitness testimony to justify things we know is not reasonable today in modern society, not thousands of years ago. 500 people claiming to have seen something, or a testimony from historical writers who are unnamed, who we don't know, writing documents about hearsay accounts 35 years after the event. And those modern accounts are not sufficient to justify the claims of these things existing. Why would the testimony in those cases be justifiable? Because I think we should absolutely consider the evidence, and we should never exclude anything a priori as possible explanations. But that evidence does not seem to be sufficient to be able to justify the claims that a miracle occurred.
I think that's fair, but I would respond by saying that I think the resurrection is a really interesting test case of that. So first of all, is that an extraordinary event? Absolutely. Does it have a wealth of evidence for it? That's where you and I would need another conversation. And actually, you would have a better conversation with someone like Tom Wright about it than I would. I mean, his book, which I mentioned earlier, The Resurrection of the Son of God, I used to say to my students, buy it. It'll give you, first of all, a terrific sense of the history of the ancient world, but also then it's so large you can build an extension on your house with it as the foundation. I mean, this is a very careful piece of sifting through the history, not with necessarily the kind of surface way that some Christian apologists have sometimes gone into it, simply taking out arguments here, there in order to prove a point, but actually a very balanced sense of what was going on in terms of worldviews and the evidence for the resurrection. Now, my contention would be to you, from my very limited knowledge, would be that actually that could be a very fruitful conversation in terms of the weight of evidence that leads you to conclude that the resurrection of the Son of God is the best interpretation of the evidence around. But let me say, as I started, that this won't convince people in terms of proof. That's not, for me, what it's about. I think we can have a conversation just like this, and then we can go away as friends, saying that we assess the arguments in different ways, which is, you know, the great thing about your programs in this sense. It allows people to do that, and you do it very graciously. But it does allow a conversation to happen. And I think when we come to this kind of form of history, there's a conversation about an extraordinary event with, from my perspective, quite extraordinary evidence for it. So that's how I would respond to Laplace and Hume and indeed Professor Sagan at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's interesting response. I definitely agree. I think that's definitely an important conversation to have about history and what would qualify as evidence. We've been going for about an hour, and you said that was about how much time you had. Do you have time for a few questions?
I have, but very briefly.
Okay.
I need to be elsewhere in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Absolutely. You can tell me when you need to go whenever. So,
yes,
Lord Jeffrey asked, did you feel like God existed before choosing Christianity?
Interesting question. Yes, in the sense that I grew up with parents who believed in God, and I had some kind of intellectual belief in the existence of God. Around about the age of 14, I wandered away from any kind of real commitment to that, simply because an intellectual belief in God seemed to me to be neither here nor there. It didn't actually make any difference to the real important things in teenage life that were around at the time. It was a subjective experience of the presence of God at the age of 17 that translated that kind of general belief in a guy with a grey beard sitting upstairs, setting the universe off, to a God who was present and extraordinary in the midst. That was the change.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Flyboy CGC asks, sunsets are beautiful and often left in awe, but that doesn't seem to indicate a disembodied mind exists.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I don't believe in a disembodied mind, by the way.
And, even for God?
Well, that's, I mean, how you define body and how you define mind when it comes to the divine. You're absolutely right, Tom, to raise that. But let me just say that for me, I don't believe in what many Christians would believe in terms of a soul, a disembodied soul. Seems to me that's not true to either the Hebrew tradition or the New Testament tradition, or to what we know about the interchangeability and interdependency of mind and body. So for me, it's actually how our sense perceptions respond and how they are processed within the wider context. And for me, the resurrection is a bodily resurrection, and therefore I don't believe that the Christian hope is about me floating up as a disembodied soul onto a cloud and playing a greyish harp forever, but actually is resurrection of the whole person, a resurrection body. But that's a huge area. Forgive me for not fully going into it.
Yeah, there was one last super chat. There's lots of other questions. People are really interested in hearing your thoughts. So I'll have to have you come back on to have another conversation sometime.
Well, if it's any use, I mean, yeah, please. Yeah.
So yeah, the last question was, what would be different if God wasn't real? From Meat Machine.
Wow, that's a great question, and I think if God wasn't real, I think the universality and simplicity and beauty of the physical laws would be very difficult to understand. I think the sense of the transcendent would be very difficult to understand. And I think Jesus of Nazareth would be almost impossible to understand.
It's a good answer, definitely. So yeah, thanks for coming on. You said you got to go like right about now. So I really appreciate you and really appreciate you coming on. Thanks again. And I'll love to talk with you again sometime.
Thank you, Tom. Bye-bye now.